Grace and Truth. This is going to be the sermon on the seventh commandment in our 10 Commandments series, but I wanted to pre-record it and do it like this rather than live stream it, because during the Wuhan shutdown right now, we're doing so much of our ministry over live stream, but with the seventh commandment, it gets into some pretty mature subject matter, and some of this stuff, if we trace it out in the Bible, winds up being pretty rated R, and so I didn't want to send this into your living rooms on a Sunday morning and have your little kids sitting there like, Mom, what's fornication? So I figured I would do it like this, make sure the kids are somewhere else, and let's get into what the Word of God says. In Exodus chapter 20, verse 14, we find the seventh commandment, and it's simply this: you shall not commit adultery. Plain and simple, you shall not commit adultery. It seems easy enough, right? And you guys know how the 10 Commandments work by this point. A lot of us are going to feel like, well, I've never cheated on my spouse, never slept with anybody else other than that person, and so I am righteous when it comes to, to this commandment. But you know what's going to happen, right? Jesus is going to swoop in from out of frame and he's going to say, not so fast. Because the Bible tells us over and over again, especially as we're looking at the 10 Commandments, that the man looks at the outward appearance. Okay, we have maybe never done anything that like physical with the members of our bodies that we consider would break the seventh commandment. We've never committed adultery by our narrow definition of it. But then God's going to come in and say, the Lord looks at the heart, and there are heart conditions behind adultery that you still have and practice and foster and love, actually. There are preconditions internal to us to committing adultery. And we still love that temptation, the thrill of the chase, maybe feeling like we're getting away with something. All of these things are those deep, dark places where when God gives a command about our actions, He's really going back to the root of our actions, which is the heart condition behind it. So God's going to do some heart surgery here, and He's going to start with the seventh commandment: you shall not commit adultery. But what I want to do today is not just talk about adultery and what's wrong with, human sexual relationships and everything like that. I want to start with what's right. I want to describe what God intended and what He designed when He set up the sexual relationship between a husband and a wife in a lifelong marriage. Because if we can paint this picture and we can see the good that God is doing and the good that God intends, then it makes the warnings much more clear. Because it's like, hey, look at this, the glory of what He's done here. And then when we see adultery, we see that as a greater violation. It's not some kind of whoopsie-doo. It's not just something that's in our past. It's actually a great assault on one of God's greatest gifts. So today we're going to talk about sex done right, we're going to talk about sex done wrong, and we're going to see what God says about all of this, because laid out in the middle of this is a pathway of great blessing. And here's where we're going to end up today. The Christian, the one who is following God, the disciple of Christ, actually has access to greater joy in the bedroom than the non-Christian does. Pretty cool how God set all this up. So let's take a look at it. First off, there's this kind of weird idea that I guess it would follow along what we call chronological snobbery, right? There's this weird idea that there was this golden age of chastity in the past, that like everybody used to only have sex once they were married and there was no fornication. I mean, maybe some of the really bad people in a society, but society used to honor, what we would now say are strictly Christian values. That's not the case. There's never been a time where human sexuality was under control. It has always been this wildfire that is threatening to burn everything to the ground. And so when God made this proclamation in the seventh commandment 3,000 years ago, He wasn't predicting a future problem. He was addressing a current problem, and it's always been a current problem. Okay, so He says, do not commit adultery. It's in the list of 10 things to do and not do to follow the Lord. Very short list. This one makes the list. Super important. One of the reasons that God puts this on the list is because it's one of His most precious gifts. Sex inside of a marriage is something that, if I could say it this way, He's more proud of that. He's almost most proud of that in all of His creation. We'll take a look at the creation order and where this comes in the order of how God did things. And you can see this is a very special issue to Him. And so since it's a great gift from God, it's also under great attack by the world, the flesh, and the devil. And God's greatest gifts are also the swords that cut deepest when they cut the wrong way. Right? So we're going to take a look at what God intended here, because there's something here worth protecting when it comes to marital sexual intimacy. And the church is a place where like we've actually got that truth. Okay? The church has not always gotten this right. If you take a look at the church fathers throughout history, or different phases of church history, sometimes we've gotten it wrong. We've treated sex with like a kind of a hands-off approach. Now, the Bible is never pornographic. It's never salacious. Like, oh yeah, let's satisfy our senses by writing some romance novels in there. The Bible's not pornographic, but it is extremely celebratory of the sexual relationship, and it's clear and it's poetic. So on the two sides of this, the avoiding sex versus the biblical view of sex, on the avoiding it, you take a look at guys like Tertullian in church history, a couple hundred years after Jesus, right? And Tertullian said, sex bad, all bad, okay? He actually made the comment, I would rather the human race go extinct than to approve of one of my parishioners' sexual urges towards their spouse. He said, just knock it off. You can get married, build a house together and whatever, but just, separate bedrooms or something, I don't know. Ambrose comes along, and now I got to tell you, I love Ambrose. Ambrose is my guy. It's like Ambrose and Athanasius, those two guys. I just love these guys. But he was wrong on this one. And he said, okay, sex is allowable because God loves children and new life and the family dynamic and all that. And I guess sex is necessary for that to happen. So it's okay in that, for procreation reasons. But then after that, you pretty much want to wash your hands and then stop thinking about it, right? He says, avoid it, it's a necessary evil. And then Augustine, having been discipled by Ambrose, comes in and says something very similar. He says, it's allowable, but it's shameful. Sexual urges in general are a sign of the fall, and they are shameful. So these guys were a little bit off. The Bible is not so prudish about the sexual relationship. Let me read you a couple of passages from Song of Solomon, which, by the way, is a book about the love between a husband and a wife, and this whole thing just swirls around this physical passion that they have for each other. Check this out, Song of Solomon 1. May he kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for your love is better than wine. Draw me after you, and let us run together. The king has brought me into his chambers. So this gal has married the king, and she's actually the aggressor here, isn't she? She's actually the initiator of the sexual relationship, or at least, what they're about to do there. Later on in verse 15, he says back to her, how beautiful you are, my darling. How beautiful you are. Your eyes are like doves. And she says back to him, how handsome you are, my beloved. So pleasant. Indeed, our couch is luxuriant. You know what that means? That means our bed, that's a place I like to be, okay? Our bed is a comfortable place. That's where I feel relaxed and at home. I feel comfortable when I'm in bed with you. Chapter 4, just a couple more verses as an example here. How beautiful is your love, my sister, my bride. And that means, ethnic sister, member of my people group, all right? How much better is your love than wine, the fragrance of your oils, or perfumes, right? Than all kinds of spices. Your lips, my bride, drip honey. Honey and milk are under your tongue, and the fragrance of your garments is like the fragrance of Lebanon. These guys are not shy. Now, they veil what they're saying in poetry, so there's a dignity to it. But at the same time, they're being pretty clear, right? They want to close the door and have some fun, and they're about to. They're declaring their intentions to do just that and to enjoy it just fine. So this is the way that God created things. Okay? Sex is a good thing. It's supposed to be fun, and it's designed to be within a marriage where a husband and wife can pursue each other, and then each spouse gets actually what they are pursuing. This is a big difference. If we pursue sex out in the world, we may get the nerve stimulation, but we're never actually going to get the fullness of what God designed to be expressed within that sexual relationship. So think about the creation order, how God set this up, okay? What I want to do now is I want to paint a picture for where sex fits within God's creation, and hopefully what you'll see here is like the Bible describes it, like, that's kind of awesome. We're going to see layers of awesomeness within God's design for sex, all right? So God creates everything, and it was formless and void. This is how the Bible starts out, okay? So it was just kind of, I call it the squish. It was just like this marshy sort of swamp, you get the impression. And God had to come in and separate the land from the water. And so God starts creating order out of what was disorder, which God's really good at. And so he makes land and oceans, and then he starts making various forms of life. And there's trees and plants, and then there's animals that crawl on the ground, and then there's fish in the sea and birds up in the air, and all of these different layers of complexity. And then God does things, after he does all of these things around nature, then he creates man. Now, man is created special. He is created, as the Bible says, in the image of God. So man is God's representative to handle and manage all of this stuff. And man is his name is Adam, which is just a Hebrew word that means man. And he runs around and he's kind of putting everything in order in God's name. And he's saying, I'm going to call these animals, ducks, and I'm going to call these animals bears. And he's just kind of, taking ownership, stewardship. He's managing the creation of God. But he's noticing all of this stuff that, he's doing it alone. And he's kind of bummed. And so when God creates Adam, he says, this is good. It's not done yet, but it's good. So what he does is he makes for Adam a helper that is suitable for him. And this is Eve, okay? So now pay attention to this, because when God made a helper for the man, he didn't make another man, because man was incomplete in himself. So if God had made another man, he essentially would have been just doubling the problem. There would have been two sets of the same incompleteness. So what he did instead was he made a woman. He made a complementary human. And this is what we call complementarian creation. And we've said it many times here before. You notice that the way God did this, he put Adam to sleep and he took out a rib and fashioned it into woman the same way he fashioned Adam out of the dust. And so God did not take part of Adam's head, because the woman was not going to be above him. He did not take part of his foot, because the woman was not going to be below him. He took something from Adam's side, because she was going to be next to him. And so these two, man and woman, would make up for each other's gaps in the image of God, because neither of these were fully like God. And so they make up for each other's gaps. They lock arms side by side, and they go and they take care of God's creation. And then God says, fill the earth and subdue it. He says, be fruitful and multiply. In other words, make more of yourself. So he gives them the sexual relationship inside of this union that he has created, right? So to recap here, he makes everything, makes Adam to manage it. It's not good for man to be alone, so he puts Adam to sleep, makes a woman out of the rib of the man. Adam wakes up, and he essentially takes his wedding vows, which are very poetic. He sort of breaks into song. It's kind of like Aladdin or something. Like it gets almost a little uncomfortable. And he takes his wedding vows towards his wife. He takes responsibility for her in front of God. It's the first wedding ceremony. And then God says, all right, I will bless this marriage, this union of who were two individuals, now one life unit, one home. And out of this amplification of human life, where two are being kind of assumed into one, then out of that is going to come more life. So God creates life on top of life on top of life, and then marriage as an amplification of life in his image, and then sex, which creates babies, which springs more life out of this already abundant life. So you see, sex isn't just about doing stuff that feels good. God has a purpose in creating all of this, and it fits somewhere in his design. So with the marriage then, we see, with the wedding ceremony specifically, we see two different kinds of vows. We see that Adam takes verbal vows in front of God, and that's recorded for us. And then God says, now I want you guys to go and give yourselves physically over to each other and be fruitful and multiply. And the commands for, I should say permissions is probably a word that would explain it better. The permission for married couples to have sex is all throughout the Bible. And so we see verbal vows in public, but then there are physical vows that are taken in private. Okay, and we call that, what happens on the wedding night, we call that consummating the marriage, or putting a capstone, finishing the process of creating the marriage. At that point, it's official, right? In fact, in the wedding ceremony, you have vows exchanged, you've got all of the various ceremonies and whatever your culture is, and then usually at the end of, always in the Western world, but usually at the end of the wedding ceremony, the preacher will say what? You may kiss your bride. Now that's not just something we threw in there because it's cute and we want to see the lovebirds, give each other a little peck. What that is actually a kind of a statement or a proclamation that, hey, there's another kind of vow to take. There's more to happen to solidify this union between two people, but it's not for right now. It's for private. And so they give each other a kiss to say there's a physical unity that is appropriate here, and it's kind of an acknowledgement that there's more to come. Okay, so verbal vows in public, in front of God, in front of witnesses, and then physical vows in private, and that's the consummation. Many times, throughout Western civilizations, the consummation of the marriage has been just as much a legal part of the process as anything else. It's not when you sign the paper for the state. It's not when you do the wedding ceremony. That's all part of it. But then the marriage would actually not be official. I don't know what the current laws are on this, but the marriage would not be official unless it had been consummated. That's actually part of the vows. You guys want to hear something weird? Back in the day, like Reformation Germany, about 500 years ago, when Martin Luther was running around and stuff, what would happen was that the parents of the bride and the parents of the groom, yeah, it's going to get weird. The parents of the bride and the parents of the groom would actually have to be in the room while the new bride and groom were consummating, because there were, dowries changing hands, there were legal bindings between families and things like that, and the dads had to make sure that all of the legal steps for this marriage had been fulfilled. You're talking about inheritances that are on the line and things like that. So they would actually have to be in the room to witness the consummation. I'm glad we don't live in those times, right? But it's a serious thing is what I'm getting at. It's a serious thing. So there's verbal vows, there are physical vows. And God, He sees all of this. He put all of this in place, and He cares about it, and it gets His stamp of approval. So what is the point then of the sexual relationship? God's got this legal structure for marriage in His mind where, at this point it becomes official, and God says go through this, this, and that. Okay, the question is why? And there's really two reasons for it. One is procreational, one is recreational, all right? So Malachi chapter 2, God expects people to know this, and he kind of yells at them for not realizing it. Malachi 2, 13 to 15. He says, "This is the second thing you do. You cover the Lord's altar with tears, with weeping, and with groaning, because He no longer regards the offering or accepts it with favor from your hand. But you say, well, why does He not? Because the Lord was witness between you and the wife of your youth." You see, there's another participant in this marriage besides husband and wife. God has an opinion about what's happening here. "The Lord was witness between you and the wife of your youth, to whom you have been faithless. You have committed adultery. Though she is your companion and your wife by covenant, did He not make them one with a portion of the Spirit in their union? And what was the one God seeking? Godly offspring. So guard yourselves in your spirit, and let none of you be faithless to the wife of your youth." So look at what he says there. He says God created this marriage with a portion of the Spirit. And when one spouse is wronged, God actually is an active participant in advocating for the spouse that has been wronged, that has been cheated on. And what's the point of all of this stuff? He says here, there are other places in the Bible that give other details, but here in Malachi 2, the point of marriage is godly offspring. In other words, have kids and disciple them, right? Teach them how to follow the Lord. And so this is why in Malachi, God gives the marriage and the sexual relationship is so that new life would come out of that, and then we would teach those children how to live in the loving structure of the Lord. Let me put it this way. When God said, fill the earth, He said, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. We're not just supposed to fill the earth with the image of God in humanity. We're also supposed to fill the earth with the character of Christ. We're supposed to fill the earth not just with biological material that God created to represent Him in the world, but with the moral dimensions of what God loves and what God hates, and justice and righteousness. And all of that stuff is learned and passed along and fostered in the home. And the home is based on the marriage. And so when there are two individuals, they will get married, they form a family. That family will produce children. Those children then are taught about the fear and admonition of the Lord. They grow up, marry other people, have more children, and you end up with a society. So as the home structure crumbles, society crumbles. Now you can see where I'm going with this. If somebody commits adultery, it's not just an act that affects them and hurts their spouse. When these kinds of things become acceptable in a society, when this kind of stuff becomes normal, it slits the throat of society on every level of relationship, eventually. Because the home is the basis for everything. And when that crumbles, society crumbles afterwards. This is why in Romans 1, Paul gives this long list of sinful behaviors and proclivities and things like that. And then right at the end, verse 31 or 32, he says, and not only do they practice these things, but they give hearty approval to those that practice them. In other words, it became normal in society. And so society flew apart. You see, when we do things God's way, it has the effect of producing life, and not only the image of God as we understand it, but also the character of Christ spreading throughout the world. When these things are done wrong, it's a great force of destruction. So, before we turn the corner, let's summarize here what's right. Sex in a marriage not only flows from the commitment that these two spouses have for each other, it also maintains the commitment that they have for each other, and it amplifies the commitment they have for each other. Let me put it in more modern terms. Sex in a marriage comes from love. It maintains the love that's there, and it amplifies the love that we share with each other. Okay? So it comes from love. When you love somebody according to God's way of loving them, you give yourself to them. So Jesus says, no greater love has anyone than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. And so love to God is not really emotional. Like, there are emotional aspects to it, but it's not just like, oh, I just love you and I just feel a connection with you and whatever. Those are some emotions that come and go. But love is where you offer yourself to somebody else. You consider their best interest above your own, and the ultimate expression of love is when you lay down your life and you die for somebody. You consider their well-being as more important than your own survival instinct, your own biological impulses. Okay? So when two people commit this kind of love to each other for a lifetime in the presence of God and witnesses, then the sexual relationship in there that was the initial consummation of that, that's like every time this married couple has sex together, what they're doing is reaffirming the covenant. It's like covenantal cement. Okay, so we do this with all sorts of covenants. For example, as a church, we take communion. And when we take communion, what we're doing is we are acknowledging that God made a covenant with us, the new covenant, in the blood of His Son. And that's done. It's a finished act. And yet, when we go and we take the bread and the cup, we are reminding ourselves, we are reaffirming, we are cementing that covenant over and over and over again. When married couples close the door and have sex together, God sees that as a covenant reaffirmation within that marriage. It's a good thing. Okay? And it's a good thing to reaffirm your covenant as often as you want to. He gave total freedom in that area. Okay? He gave a couple of boundaries in 1 Corinthians 7, which we'll get into in another sermon, but he just basically said, hey, you guys reaffirm all you want to. So it comes from the love that these couples, these spouses have for each other. It maintains, it reaffirms the love that they have for each other, and then it also amplifies the love that they have for each other. Right? Which is kind of strange. I mean, because when sex is just a normal thing in life, it's just, you're married, this is what you do occasionally, you get to have a bunch of fun, and being married is awesome, right? But how is there this constant growing effect of the sexual relationship? Well, there actually is, because in a marriage, what happens is the more private memories you have together, the deeper the well of joy is for you guys to draw from as you grow closer together. I've said it many times, right? If you talk to somebody, that's a monologue. It could be helpful or not helpful. If somebody talks back, now you've got a dialogue. You've got a conversation. If you have enough conversations, you've got a relationship. And if you have enough good conversations, you've got a good relationship. And sex within a marriage works the same way, right? There's the one consummating act, and that's a precious memory that's private, that is just between you two, and you don't have to share it with anybody else. It's special. Right? But then the more times this happens, and the more you guys grow with each other and learn about each other's preferences and things like that, you're going to know things about your spouse that nobody else gets to know. You're going to have memories with your spouse that nobody else gets to share. It's private. It's just none of their business. And all of those things wind up being, like, I'll put it this way, it's ours. Right? It's nobody else's, it's ours. And what's ours is special to us. And so that well keeps deepening the more sexual experiences a couple has with each other over the years. This is the reason, by the way, that a promiscuous lifestyle where you're just running out and hopping in the sack with whoever you can and tossing your body around like a frisbee, that's the reason that it's so unfulfilling, is because you don't get to deepen the well with anybody, or at least not for a long period of time. You always have to start over. Now, the cool thing, I'll tell you what I'll do. Here you go. You guys want me to give you the playbook to win the Super Bowl here? I'm going to teach you right now one of the primary ways to spice up your sex life in a marriage. All right, here we go. Now, this is just coming from we have a lot of pastoral conversations where couples are like, I feel like we're drifting apart and this and that. Sometimes the sexual relationship hurts the emotional relationship or vice versa. Whichever way the causal arrows are pointing on this, let me give you guys a tip that's gonna ignite some stuff. All right, here we go. Grab your notepads. Sex is just like the rest of marriage. It's actually about service. It's an act of service. Okay? It's not an act of taking, it's an act of giving. So forget about sex for just a second. Let's just take a look at a healthy marriage. Both spouses are serving each other. There's two ways you can do this, right? You can say, gimme, 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 and beat the person down and say, I need emotional stability from you. I need provision from you. I need you to do the chores. I need you to do all this stuff. I need you to compliment me. Give me, give me, give me. Well, when you try and raise yourself up on somebody else's shoulders, you're just going to wind up crushing them and falling with them, right? And so when both spouses are doing this, it has a very degenerative effect. The way that God designed loving relationships, and especially the marriage relationship, is that each spouse would give themselves, would lower themselves to serve the other one and say, what can I do to lift you up? And then there's this climbing action where the lower each spouse seeks to get under the other one, the higher you both wind up together. Right? Now, that's true in a marriage. It's true in any area of life, but it's also true in the bedroom. If you say, you know what, I've got my preferences or what I feel like doing, but we're going to get to try this again tomorrow or in a couple of days or whatever, so let me put my preferences aside. What can I do to make you happy? And when both spouses are doing that, both spouses wind up being well served, and the joy that's possible within marital sex is actually amplified by service. In other words, give up what you want and you'll wind up finding a lot more of what you want. And by the way, just to lay this out there, if you give up your own preferences and yield to your spouse, you're going to wind up enjoying what they're suggesting quite a bit anyway. This stuff tends to be pretty fun regardless of who's calling the shots. And so that's one of the reasons that actually when marriage and sex are done God's way, we have access to a kind of joy that you don't have anywhere else. Let me put it this way. Christians get to have better sex than non-Christians. The culture won't tell you that, right? We see about 10,000 sexually suggestive images a year on average just from TV programming and commercials. We're not talking about the internet. We're not talking about just 10,000 suggestive images or comments or whatever per year on TV. And by a ratio of about 10 to 1, they are with non-married couples or the marriage situation is ambiguous. You get a mattress commercial with a couple and they don't show their left hand because they don't want to say whether they're married or not, right? So it's those non-married or maritally ambiguous situations because married people aren't seen as fun, right? When you get married, they're like, well, life's over. That's only one person for the rest of your life. Yeah, but you get to grow and express and have an area of safety and freedom and trial and even error, right? So here's what you do. You communicate with each other. If you want to light things up in the bedroom, communicate with each other. Do a little homework, right? Hey, what works for you? What doesn't? Let's try more of that. Don't ever do that again. Like, that kind of stuff. And then once you figure out your spouse's preferences and desires or whatever phase they're in or whatever, then you know what? Go for it. And lay aside your own preferences. When both people are doing this, you wind up with greater joy than is ever possible outside of the structure that God had created. So, last point about what God has done right, about sex done right according to God's design. Okay, Ephesians chapter 5. When the Apostle Paul explains marriage from God's perspective, he says, I want you to understand this, and I want this to teach you something about God. Watch this. I'm just going to take an excerpt here, verse 25. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for her. That's love, right? He sacrifices himself for somebody. So that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, that he might present to himself the church in all her glory, having no spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she would be holy and blameless. Verse 32, this mystery is great, but I am speaking with reference to Christ and the church. Or some translations will say, this mystery is great, but I'm saying that it refers to Christ and the church. So what he says here is, Sex is a gospel issue. Marriage is a gospel issue. Now, let's not get it twisted here, okay? When he says that, yeah, the husband-wife relationship, it's kind of like, or it's made to teach us about the relationship between Jesus and those that are saved, about his bride, the church, right? Let's not get it twisted. Jesus is not, sexual here, and God is not a sexual being. Instead, what he's saying here is that what is expressed between a husband and wife sexually is expressed between God and his church spiritually. In other words, God loves us so much with such an enrapturing and kind of, I guess I could say, euphoric type of passion that when he created humanity, he created a way for us to express the same types of feelings towards each other. And that, for humanity, that method of expression is sexuality. God is not a sexual being, but he allowed us to be so that we can just have a kind of hint of that sort of joy and expression in a relationship that is private and precious and expressive in ways that words really can't be. Okay, so what a husband and wife express to each other sexually, God expresses with his church spiritually. And so he wants us to know something about how much he loves us by the way that we love our spouses. Okay? So there you go. God cares about sex. He put his stamp of approval on this whole thing, and he even gave us some boundaries and parameters inside of which to really enjoy all of this. The key to a happy and flourishing and vibrant and passionate sex life between a husband and a wife is the same as the rest of life, right? It's joy, Jesus, others, and you, right? So now I'm not saying that, while you guys are closing the door, put a movie on for the kids and just be like, hey, we're going to go have a conversation or whatever, right? In those moments, you're not supposed to be reciting Bible verses and thinking about high Christology and stuff like that. That's not where I'm going with that. But just know that when you guys close the door, God approves and he smiles, okay? Because he created this marriage with this in mind. And so you don't have to be thinking about it, but God can, and he's perfectly happy with what you guys are doing. In fact, he has blessed it. All right. Jesus, others, and you. If, by the way, you are not able to have kids, if there's physiological reasons, or whatever the case may be, right? I don't want you to think that your marriage is not as precious to God, or that something is wrong with you. We live in a fallen world, and there's the general design of God, and then there's a million other things that happen or that go wrong, or details and exceptions to consider, and God's sovereign throughout all of that. So when we say that marriage and sex are connected and that children are the reason for all of this, I just want you to know, God is an individual God, and he sees you, and he has plans for you that can bring glory to him. And so if you're not able to engage in some of these things, then just know the world is crazy and God is active in all of it, all right? We're just talking about the general design. When Emily and I were first married, we had an apartment, and we had my sister and her husband over. And the apartment had a fireplace in it. And so I didn't know anything really. I'd never really had a fireplace growing up. I'm like, look, I know how to chop wood. I know how to start a campfire. We'll just do that inside. So we just pack this fireplace, me and my brother. And the girls are sitting back like, I don't think they know what they're doing. We totally didn't. We packed this fireplace with wood and with paper and twigs and all kinds of accelerant, right? Second floor apartment. We light the thing on fire. And the fire comes out of the fireplace. I'm glad it didn't burn the apartment to the ground, but there was a very nice, expensive vacuum cleaner that I think we got as a wedding gift or something next to the fireplace. And the fire was so hot, it spits out and it melted the vacuum cleaner that was next to the fireplace. Melted it, right? And so it was just basically a roughly identifiable blob of plastic, but it certainly didn't function anymore. We needed a new vacuum cleaner. Now, there's a pretty common way of understanding sex in a marriage that is a lot like that. Sex is a fire that God has created, and marriage is the fireplace inside of which God created it to burn. And so when the fire gets out of the fireplace, the death and destruction and the carnage and the pain and the damage that is done is really just about impossible to tally in a lot of situations. So what I want to do is I want to turn the corner from God's good design, what God says we are able to participate in sexually and do correctly, and I want to turn the corner from there and go into the seventh commandment. You shall not commit adultery. Because you see, when we do that, what we're doing is we're taking God's way of doing things, flipping it on its head, and then expecting God's blessing and expecting or chasing the result of His design to apply to us when we run contrary to His design. It's crazy. There's no way we should expect that to work. If God gives us a pathway for joy and we walk the opposite pathway, we should not expect joy. We should expect pain and misery and societal degeneration, which is exactly what we've got. So when God said, do not commit adultery, He was protecting us, right? He was saying, I have a pathway for you to walk, and it results in joy that you don't have access to if you don't do things my way. Trust me. Stay between these lines. And we just say, no, I'm going to do my own thing. And God warns us up front in the Ten Commandments. It's not going to end well. Don't do it. So what's adultery? Oftentimes we think of adultery just as cheating on our spouse, and then we think that we're fine. But Jesus uses this word when He's talking about sexual immorality. He uses the word porneia, which obviously is where we get the word pornography. But the Greek word porneia it's just this junk drawer full of all kinds of sexual immorality. And you don't even really need to list it off. Like, it's homosexuality and bestiality and, whatever else. But people come up with the weirdest stuff to get their jollies. And I don't need to keep expanding the list indefinitely. So here we go. God made sex to function joyfully and procreationally and recreationally inside of a marriage. Right there. Anything outside of that is porneia. It's sexual immorality. And what Jesus is going to do is He's going to come along and say in the Sermon on the Mount, if you even look to a woman with lustful intent, you have committed adultery in your heart. If you do anything other than what I have designed, you have committed porneia, sexual immorality, and we're breaking the seventh commandment. And so what God does is He really ups the ante. Okay, there's this idea that, well, hey, you can look but don't touch. And Jesus says, no, you can't look. Now, the problem with that is that turns us all into adulterers. There is nobody who has always kept the seventh commandment. And, of course, the problem with that is these things stack up on top of each other, and before you know it, God's throwing the book at you. If you break the seventh commandment, you've also broken the first commandment because you're following some other ultimate desire other than God. Like adultery and lust and all of these things, these are idolatry issues. Something is ultimate in that moment other than God. So if you break the seventh commandment, you've broken the first, and you've broken the 10th because you're coveting something that's not yours. And the 10th commandment is you shall not covet your neighbor's stuff. And if you want somebody else's wife, somebody else's husband, wife, future husband, potential wife or potential husband, that person is not yours. And so lust is a breaking of at least the first, seventh, and 10th commandments. And if you take somebody else's spouse, then you're breaking the 8th commandment, stealing. And if you do violence to this person and their conscience or their body, then you're crossing lines with the 6th commandment regarding murdering and destroying the image of God. So this thing is not disconnected from other stuff. And it's not just a matter of like sitting on your hands and saying, well, I've never slept with anybody else, so I guess I'm good on number 7. That's not the case. Guys, we have some stuff to repent of. And there are real, actual consequences for this sin. It's not private. Let me just try and shatter some of the reasons that we're casual about this. Okay, I'm talking about adultery. I'm talking about pornography. I'm talking about imagining the sexual possibilities with somebody, which we call lust. Any of that stuff. We have the idea. We usually don't articulate it this way, but we've got the assumption or the idea that lust and porn and various forms of adultery and porneia, that it's anonymous, that it's affordable, and that it's accessible. Okay? Let me deal with 1 and 3 first. It's anonymous. We say, well, look, it's just my thoughts, or it's just my computer. It's not hurting anybody. I know my IP address is tied to it, so it could be traced back to me, but nobody cares. Come on. This is just my deal. Guys, it's not. First off, God sees it. And second, we have promises in the Bible that there is nothing that is hidden that will not be made known. Everything's going to come out eventually. And how many horror stories do we have to hear from guys about them getting busted or found out somehow about a porn issue or a flirtatious text they had with somebody else or reconnecting with an old girlfriend from high school or whatever? It's not anonymous. Okay? It's accessible. Well, yeah, sexual immorality is accessible. But let me be clear on this. What you want, what you're chasing when you chase pornea, is not accessible. You're not going to get what you want. Because God created our sexual desires to fulfill a certain longing that we have, and it involves relationship and love and mutual sacrifice and mutual service and commitment and stuff like that. You're not going to find that in sexual immorality. Okay? And it's also certainly not affordable. So it's not anonymous. It's not as accessible as you think it is, at least not what you're actually chasing. You're going to wind up feeling unfulfilled and empty. It's not anonymous, not accessible, and it's not affordable, guys. Lust is expensive. It is so expensive. Let me just pass along something that has been very helpful for me that an older, wiser man told me. He said, here's how you fight sexual temptation. Okay, here's what you do. You walk through in your mind what would happen if you gave into it, and just live there for a little bit. So what I do is, and I've done this many, many times, this is a well-worn pathway for me, is I walk down my hallway in my house, and I take down the pictures, and I pack them up, because we got to move, because I got to go somewhere to find a job, right? Because I'm a pastor. If I commit sexual immorality, if I'm breaking the 7th commandment, I don't get to show up and do my job, you know? So me and the family, we got to relocate. Which, by the way, even if I could fake it for a while, which, you know, has been done many times by a lot of pastors, even if I could break the 7th commandment, commit adultery, or nurse a porn addiction or whatever, and I could show up and fake doing my job, it's not going to work for very long. My job is entirely dependent on the power of the Holy Spirit to make things happen. So if I could fool somebody, it wouldn't last very long, because God would just kind of, you know, he would pull his hand of blessing and power back. You know, it's not like I'm stamping out car parts in a factory. That would be a little bit different. I would have to move. So I take down the pictures. I think about, you know, my wife watching me do this and the look in her eyes, and my kids as they get older trying to, you know, process and figure out just how did Dad screw all of this up? What happened there? And then when they find out what I actually did, having to explain that. I got a lot of kids, guys. I would get sliced by that on a heart level, just over and over and over again. And I picture having to call my parents and tell them what I did and the effects of that, and calling my wife's parents and then her siblings and my siblings finding out what had happened and just bearing that shame. You know, there's nothing that you can offer me that's attractive enough to make all of that worth it. And so take yourself on the mental journey down the loss and the carnage and the destruction of having committed sexual immorality. And just let that sink in. Feel that. I'll tell you what happened. I went to, this was just yesterday. Yeah, yesterday. I went to a, we'll just call it the coffee shop. I'm not going to tell you where, because it was recent, and I don't want you guys to go in and meet this person accidentally and be like, oh, that's the girl. So I was going to see my buddy. My buddy likes a certain place, and so I stopped at the coffee shop to get him a drink, just to kind of brighten up his day a little bit, right? So I go to the coffee shop, and there's a guy in line in front of me, and the girl behind the counter, she's wearing a mask because, you know, the virus and whatever, and everybody there had to wear masks while they were working. So she's got a mask on, and you can still tell, even though the mask is big, she's a cute little thing. She's maybe, you know, 18, I don't know, but she's got a lot of eye makeup on, her hair is very well done and all of this, and it was just sort of one of those, like, I didn't even think it cognitively, it just, the thought passed my mind, like, oh, sweetie, you don't need all that makeup. Come on, you're overpaying. Like, you know, you're fine, whatever. And so, but I'm just kind of standing there watching, and I notice she is doing the flirty body language thing with the guy in front of me. You know, she's posing herself in a really nice kind of, you know, shifting her weight in a cute sort of way, and she's doing the hair thing and the shoulder thing and whatever else, right? And I'm noticing this, and I'm just like, man, that girl's trouble. Like, she's getting all flirty. She doesn't even know this dude. She's just helping him get some coffee. Then I get up to the counter, she starts throwing eyes at me, and she's getting all flirty with me, and it's like over the face mask, and it's like, you know, whatever. And I'm just sitting there thinking, like, I don't want to look up. I don't want, aside from the fact that I knew I had to preach this sermon, right? I'm like, I don't want to look up. I don't want to do anything that's like engaging with this or whatever. I don't want to see her body language. I don't want to see the way she moves. Now, why did I run away in that moment? It's because I've walked down the hallway and taken down the pictures and boxed them up in my head so many times that this young lady had nothing to offer me that was attractive enough to send me down that hallway. I ain't doing it. I'm not going to play the game. And so the world, the flesh, and the devil will throw temptation at us, and they do. And the more technologically connected things get, the more media comes at us, the more temptation there is. On a year-by-year basis, it gets worse and worse. The average exposure age for pornography goes down for children. It's something like 9 years old for girls and 5 years old for boys now, the average first exposure to porn. I mean, this is nuts. This is crazy. And I'm just not going to play the game. Like, my answer is no. God warned us what would happen, and he just said, stay away. Let me read you a verse from Proverbs 5:16. It says this. It says, it's a father talking to his son, and he's saying, stay away from the adulterous woman, right? He says, should your streams be dispersed abroad, streams of water in the streets? I mean, what he's talking about there is that when God creates people with sexual drives and urges to be used in marriage, it's a powerful flowing force for good. You get into a river that's maybe chest high, right? And it looks like the water's moving slow, but you try and walk back against that water and you realize how powerful the river actually is. And he says that's like the sex drive for, a young couple in this context specifically, the wife of your youth. And he says when you go and give that stream away to people that you're never even going to see or care about again long term especially, then what you're doing is you're taking that powerful force for good that God has given you and just kind of chucking a bucket of water in the streets. He says you're dispersing your stream, and he says what a shame that is. So the consequences of sexual immorality are societal. Everything breaks down eventually when this stuff becomes normal. They are individual. Okay, it costs us, and they're spiritual. Okay, and I want you to know this. When we indulge in sexual immorality, when we nurse this stuff, we feed that beast that's inside of us, it has the effect of drawing us away from God. It does. Now, when we give into sin, we are separated from God because of that. God will not hang out with sin. He's just not going to do it. God is holy. We're not. There's a separation there. If God were to wrap us up, he would be embracing sexual immorality. And there's no chance that the holy and perfect God is going to embrace and approve of sexual immorality, which is exactly the opposite of what he intended for the most precious part of his creation, which is the human family. He just says, no, I'm not doing it. So if you want your sexual immorality, you can have it, but you can't have me. And I want you guys to know this. There's a cost to this. Look, when I was in various youth groups and stuff like that, my youth leaders would say things like, Jesus is better than pornography. And I didn't get the link. I'm like, yeah, true, right? But in any given moment, when you're tempted by porn or by a young lady who's going to do whatever it is that she's offering to do, in that moment, you don't think, well, I could do this, but Jesus is just better. Like, okay, what am I going to do? Go and pray? Like, it just doesn't make a lot of sense, that connection. But then as I grew in my relationship with the Lord, I got what they were talking about. And what they were talking about was that any given moment when you are tempted and you have a choice, if you run towards the sin, then you are not going to have communion with God. Essentially, you need to decide what the rest of your day is going to look like. Are you going to give into that sin and have no communion with God and no access to prayer and to deep and satisfying Bible study when you read the Bible and hear the voice of the shepherd? Forget it. Gone. You chose unwisely. Now, God will make a way of escape, 1 Corinthians 10. Okay? We're not going to be tempted beyond what we are able. The temptations themselves may be too much for us to bear, but God will make a way of escape so that we don't have to fight these temptations that are stronger than we are head on. Right? And if we choose that way of escape and we repent from the sin, turn back towards God, now there's a richness and there's a vibrancy in my relationship with him that I wouldn't trade for anything. John Owen says this in his book, The Mortification of Sin. He says, the reason we fight sin as Christians is not because we're worried about going to hell. Christ saved us from that. The reason we fight sin is because it threatens the quality of our relationship with God. And at a certain point, once you've had some experiences with God and his goodness, it's just not worth it. We fight sin because Jesus is better than porn, right? And we want to be close with him. We want to be used by him. And think about it this way too. God created us for a reason, and he empowers us to do the things that he has created and called us to do. And when we pursue sexual immorality, what we're doing is saying, I'm going to do this rather than what you created me to do. We are literally missing the purpose of life. We are wasting our lives in that moment, in that day, for the purpose of, I don't know, nerve stimulation or something. And God's just like, it's not worth it, guys. It's not worth it. So this sin hurts us societally, individually, and spiritually. Look at James 4:4. You adulteress, do you not know that friendship with the world is hostility towards God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. You can't serve two masters, guys. You just can't do it. So pick what is going to make you feel good. Are you going to let sexual immorality make you feel good at the expense of all of the joy that God offers us in a fulfilling relationship with Him? It's not worth it. John 15, Jesus says, I'm telling you these things so that my joy may be in you and your joy may be made full. I want you to know this. If you go for what you think is going to make you happy sometimes, you're actually going to sacrifice all of your joy, and it's going to make you miserable. I don't want that for you. God doesn't want that for us. So, lastly, Isaiah 53:6. All of us like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned his own way, but the Lord has caused the iniquity of us all to fall on Him, on Jesus. And so I want you to know this. Those of us that are willing to admit that we have committed sexual immorality in the past, and probably will again in the future, at least in our minds, we're going to fall to these temptations. Okay? I want you to know this. Christ forgives sinners. These sins, while they are serious and while they are devastating, are not beyond the reach of God. Some of you guys feel polluted. Some of you guys feel like you've fallen from godliness in ways that you cannot be restored because you don't know what I've done, or I got all of these secrets and all of this shame. Look, God knows it. He gets it. He was there when it happened. Okay? And as horrifying of a thought as that is, it's also true. And when Jesus showed up, He took on human flesh and human temptation, and He has been tempted in every way that we are, and yet without sin. And so there are some of you guys that are tempted to do things, well, I'll put it this way. We are all tempted to do things that God says no to. Some of you guys are tempted to do things that even like the law says no to. Like we're just, our desires and the way that we are wired to pursue satisfaction, that is all fallen under the curse of sin, right? And so some of your desires are going to be very off. And some of you guys, if you were to follow through on all of your sexual desires, you'd get arrested. You know, this is not playground type of stuff. This is ugly. This hurts people, and there are laws against some of the stuff that people are predisposed to doing. But I want you to know this: whatever your preferred mode of sexual perversion, God has not forgotten about you. His cleansing, His washing with the water of the Word, His forgiveness, His blood on the cross, it applies. And so what God calls us to do is to turn away from our perversions and back to Him. Now, for some people, that will mean that you never get to have sex because you are not, you're not going to get married because you're not attracted to people of the opposite sex. And there are people out there that are not attracted to humans, right? Like it's just, they just got other weird stuff going on that God says no to. And so for people in that situation that just aren't going to get married, it can seem unfair. It can seem like this is pouring salt in a wound. Like, okay, I get it. You're telling me get married. Not really an option for me, right? Let me tell you this. No greater love has anyone than that a man lay down his life for his friends. And Jesus has called us His friends if we have faith in Him. Okay? So you will be called to lay things down for Christ. And if He is calling you to lay down your sexual desires and to not have them fulfilled, but to chase Him instead, He makes it worth it. Okay? Jesus is better than sexual immorality. He just is. So choose wisely and choose Him. Okay? Because whatever He calls you to give up, He says nobody has lost anything in this world except those that will have it restored to them 1,000 times over. And He mentions relationships in there. If you lose these relationships that you love because you're following Christ, He says, you will be restored, and the measure with which he restores things to you will be shaken and pressed down and running over. In other words, he's not going to cheat you on this stuff. When he says turn away from sin and you say, but I love that sin, and I even maybe in my body feel like I need that sin. He says, yeah, I know, but I took that sin from you. So what you feel is not the ultimate reality. What God has sovereignly declared is the ultimate reality. And what he has declared is that if you cast your sin on Christ and appeal to the cross and say, I need this sin taken away from me, he will forgive you for eternity. And he even offers you a church where you can bring this stuff in and actually achieve healing. Like we get to heal people of their sexual brokenness in all ways, whether it's just a history of fornication that has caused all kinds of destruction, or a history of adultery. We get to put marriages back together. There are various forms of just help and discipleship and everything for people who struggle with sexual sin. Sometimes God takes it away. He takes the temptation away. Sometimes he empowers people to walk through it for the rest of life, and they get to be, as much of a struggle as that is, they get to be an inspiration, an instruction, and a catalyst to help so many other people. You know, God is really, really good. And when he says no to something, it's a good no, all right? And so I want to just encourage you, turn to Christ and then come to us. This is a place where you don't need to be afraid of, you don't need to be ashamed of your sexual sin. We can deal with it. Now, we're not going to broadcast your information, right? I'm not going to pull you up in front of the church and be like, and why don't you tell everybody what you're repenting of? Like, closed doors conversations happen for a reason. But I don't want you to cower in shame, because your sexual sin is not bigger or stronger than the God who has saved you from it. It actually cowers from him. When demons see the Lord, they shudder. And so let's bring our demons into the light of Christ and just see what he's got to say about it. I promise you that there is healing in his word and in his will. All right, guys, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to pray for us, and then I'm going to offer one more time, just for anybody who's listening to this, to come and find healing in Christ. Let me pray. Father in heaven, you have given us such good gifts, and we have distorted and polluted and misshapen those gifts. Sometimes it seems like every available opportunity. And even though all of us have deviated from your path, and some people listening to this may be currently deviating from your path, you have caused the iniquity, the sins of all of us to fall on Christ, so that we will not be required to bear our own shame and our own punishment for our sin if we trust Christ to take it from us. And so I pray that you would create faith where there is now temptation, that you would create purity where there is now immorality and porneia. I pray that you would create joy where there is now death and destruction and spiritual and emotional and relational carnage. I pray that you would show people the way of escape that you create in these sins, because they can feel impossible to escape from. But with you, all things are possible, and we can do all things through Christ who strengthens us. So strengthen us to be holy in this way, and to show the world your glory, because we are qualified participants to bear your message. Clean us out and bring us to yourself. Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Guys, you can shoot an email, dustin@graceandtruthcommunity.com. You can hit us up on, Facebook if you want to, private message or whatever, Twitter, you can call. Whatever, guys. Just reach out and let's fight this stuff. We got the tools available. We're the church. This is what we do. All right, thanks for sticking with it this long, and I hope to hear from you guys soon, and to watch the healing in your lives. Thank you.